The agenda in the summer with Namkiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Infectious diseases and the lessons they've taught us so far. I'm Namkiwanuka, and tonight on the agenda this summer, a look back at what we knew 2 decades ago and why it matters during this pandemic. Also, we'll get a report from our Ontario hubs. COVID-19 came out of the blue for many of us, but 20 years ago, TVO's program Studio 2 took note of how deadly diseases were starting to travel beyond their customary boundaries. Dr. Kevin Kane is a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto and a clinician scientist at University Health Network at Toronto General Hospital. He spoke to TVO then, and we welcome him back in the provincial capital to find out more about what we've learned since. Hello, Dr. Kane. It's nice to chat to you. So we spoke to you 20 years ago, and you spoke about pandemics, pretty much predicting it was going to hit fast. What went through your mind when the world started to shut down over COVID-19?
Well, many things went through my mind, but I guess perhaps the most saddening was that, we're supposed to learn from history, but we just seem to keep repeating it. I mean, this is literally almost a parallel version of what happened to Toronto in 2003 with the first SARS virus, coronavirus 1, again, emerging in a similar scenario, predictable, and then being transmitted globally with huge economic and health impacts. This one's more contagious, so it adds a whole new dimension.
What would you say, because I was just sharing with you before we taped that I had malaria, and then I ended up getting cerebral malaria. And personally, I was very arrogant, thinking that I would be fine. So do you think there's a part of us, maybe that's why we're finding ourselves in this situation, because you say that this was predictable?
Yeah, I mean, I think many people have shown that there's certain things that we do that promote diseases not only to emerge, but we disseminate them very clearly with rapid movements of people and goods. But the fact that we're still doing the same thing that caused these things to emerge, we're still not resourcing countries in terms of monitoring and surveillance, so that we really aren't doing the steps that we could have done, should have done, to prevent not only this one from emerging, but there'll be subsequent ones.
And speaking of malaria, much of your career has been spent studying malaria. We have a clip of you. Are you ready for it? It's from 20 years ago on March 2nd, 2000. Sheldon, please roll.
Canadians are some of the best traveled populations in the world. It's estimated 3 to 5 million of us travel internationally every year, with large numbers of people going to and through areas where diseases like malaria are now rampant. We've had at least 7 people die of malaria in Ontario and Quebec in the last few years. Canada can boast one of the highest rates of imported malaria in the developed world. I'm not sure we should be very proud of that statistic, but over the last 5 years, we've annually reported somewhere between 500 and over 1,000 cases of malaria each and every year.
What lessons have you learned studying malaria that can be applied to COVID-19?
Right. I mean, I guess we've taken a more holistic approach. I mean, malaria is a very serious infection, and it remains a serious problem globally. But what we've learned is that many severe infections, including COVID, behave in very similar ways. Many people get infected, only a small proportion of people become critically ill. And if we can identify those people early, we can improve survival and their outcome. The problem is that we don't have good tools to do that. So even with COVID, the majority of people will have self-limited, uncomplicated disease, and a smaller proportion need to be in hospital, need to be supported. In low resource settings that are now getting a brunt of COVID, they have no good tools to do that. They have limited oxygen and not much in the way of ventilators. So they need to know when they first identify someone, are they going to become critically ill? Do I need to put this person in hospital, or can I safely send that person home? That's the same problem we face with all infections. About 1 billion or more people get a fever every year, and the great majority of those will respond without anything, uncomplicated, self-resolve. Maybe 1 or 2% become more severe. So we need tools to find that 1 or 2%. And we need to focus our resources on those to improve outcomes. Malaria is the same case. So what our lab's been doing is trying to develop tools that will allow us rapidly, 5 minutes, with an inexpensive $1 test, to allow healthcare workers everywhere in the world, whether it's COVID, malaria, sepsis, identify the children and adults who need to be in hospital, who need to be supported, while safely sending others that can be managed at home and save resources.
So you're saying that the tools that we need is rapid testing?
The tools we need are rapid triage tests. Mm-hmm. The same way that if your hospitals get overwhelmed with COVID, let's use COVID as an example. You want to be able to not miss anyone who needs to be admitted, who might need to be in ICU, who might need to be on an expensive new therapeutic. But you don't want to over-admit people, occupy your beds, particularly people that will do fine, that can be managed more safely at home isolation. So the same for other infections, whether that's malaria or bacterial infections. Most of us will do well. We need better tools to find the people that won't do well so that we can focus limited health resources, not only in rich countries, but particularly in low-income countries, to maximize benefit, to improve survival, but not waste them. If we over-admit 50% of people, we end up running out of money and not being able to focus those resources on where they would help, where they would do benefit.
In 1904, William Osler, who has been described as the father of modern medicine, observed, and I quote, said, "My patients are not dying from their infections, they are dying from their reactions to them." How does what he said, apply to what's happening during this pandemic?
Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying, that all of these very different infections share common pathways and that actually lead to death. We can identify those pathways earlier. That's what Osler was describing as a reaction. And those pathways can be identified in a marker of them can be identified in a finger prick blood sample that can be detected by an inexpensive test. What that allows us to do is rapidly find the people, whether it's COVID, sepsis, malaria, dengue, whatever the infection, that are tracking to something severe. So that means they can be referred and admitted. And also it suggests that we can have common therapies that would be useful against a broad range of infections that are severe. So those reactions that Osler was referring to really come down to our immune system. It gets overactivated and it damages our blood vessels. So if we can identify those processes that are happening in people when we first see them, we can triage them to hospital. We call it risk stratifile, while safely sending other people home to be managed as outpatients or at home isolation in the case of COVID. So Osler was absolutely on the money, and you'll see papers now coming out describing how the COVID host response is actually a major driver in bad outcomes with COVID. But that's the same story with sepsis. Sepsis really is your own host response is what hurts you, not the organism so much. So the organism becomes secondary. It's how you respond to it. And can we identify the people who are not responding well? And then can we intervene in that response to improve an outcome? That is really a new paradigm of the way we need to treat severe infections, irregardless of the etaology.
When SARS, you mentioned SARS before, and I remember when SARS hit Toronto, how we were all on guard. I remember traveling to the States and people staying away from me when they found out that I was from Toronto. But not as many people were affected as they have been with COVID-19. What did we learn then that should have helped us, but maybe we weren't as vigilant?
I think what we learned then is that the origin of this thing is driven by human behavior, the origin of these coronaviruses entering the human population. And they're similar to almost all emerging diseases. They all share themes, that most of these agents, these pathogens, are naturally found in an animal reservoir, and then they're given an opportunity to jump to humans. We call that a zoonosis. Basically, a bug leaps from a bat, in this case, often into an intermediate host and then into us. The thing that we seem to forget is we're the ones that are creating that problem. We're the ones that bring animals together in close quarters, for example, in these wet markets, that would never normally be in the same space together, allowing microbes to jump into a host, and then with humans all about into humans. So we tend to demonize microbes and think that they're terrible. But I think if you look at emerging infections, they've got human fingerprints all over them. We are the major drivers of our own problems, and we need to put our ante into the pot in terms of our responsibility for driving these. If we continue to alter environments, do unusual animal husbandry, we're creating these pandemics and these problems. So we need to put our activity in the problem front and center.
We're being told that in order for life to go back to normal, the only way that can happen is if we do get a vaccine. Is that the wrong way to approach this?
I think it's reactive. It's like, and humans, we think we're a very clever primate, but there's not a lot of evidence to support that. We know that we need to prevent things. We know that there are steps that we can do to do that, but we tend to wait till it's a huge problem and then throw a ton of resources at it. So I think mitigating the emergence of infections, early monitoring, and our other major problem is antimicrobial resistance, controlling the inappropriate use of antibiotics and antimicrobials in animals and in humans. We're a major driver of our own problems, and we need to address that front and foremost to prevent these things from emerging and spreading in the first place.
I keep thinking, what if we don't find a vaccine? What then?
Well, I guess we'll move towards some sort of herd immunity, which is to be defined. There is some evidence that people are getting consistent immunity following infection, although that's debatable. But this is not an efficient, cost-effective, or simple way to manage a pandemic.
Even if a vaccine becomes available, studies are showing that there are people who are hesitant to get it and others who refuse to get the vaccine because they don't believe in vaccinations. How do we manage that then?
That is a huge problem. And I think I don't claim to have the solutions, but I think we need to do a much better job of science literacy in our educational system so that people understand the risks and benefits of things that are done in healthcare. Nothing has had more of a positive impact on human health than vaccines. They are the most cost-effective thing we've ever done. So how this has been twisted into a danger is really beyond me. Our immune systems are amazing. They're used to, in our evolution, handling thousands of microbial insults all the time. We now live in a more sterile world where, in fact, our immune systems, they need something to do. This is how we evolve. This is how they protect us. So giving a vaccine is simply giving an opportunity in a safe way for your body to see cholera or typhoid or malaria in a way that it can respond appropriately as opposed to a death. It's irrational not to see the value in vaccines, but of course they need to be developed and tested safely. So it's ironic that at the same time that we've built very amazing safety processes into vaccine development, that we see Russia going by them without safety and efficacy trials. So again, this is not the way forward. We have a good way forward.
A lot of resources right now are being spent on trying to, contain COVID-19. And you've been studying pandemics for a very long time. Do you worry that resources are being taken from studying something like malaria and TB?
Oh, absolutely. I think that there will be a bad backdrop to this, where programs in Africa for measles vaccination, measles is a massive killer. We've had huge outbreaks. Again, anti-vaccine lobbies have certainly contributed to this problem. Malaria control programs, things that are important because they cause death and illness in millions of people, are being pushed to the side or being disrupted. So I think not only will you have COVID issues, we're going to have a negative impact on all our other important public health programs to control other globally important diseases like tuberculosis, HIV, and malaria. And infections in pregnancy, which and potentially impact our whole next generation of children on this planet.
We have another clip from our Studio 2 program on pandemics. Let's take a look.
the most dramatic difference between the plagues that swept through early human civilization is that because of the speed and volume at which people and goods move now, we're compressing time. The disease that killed a small child in a foreign country yesterday can kill yours today and seed a global pandemic tomorrow.
Now that you've watched that program you were on 20 years ago, I know you're a very kind person, but do you kind of feel like saying, I told you so?
No. That doesn't get us anywhere. I just would love to see us become, collectively as a species, more proactive in areas where we know the upfront cost will way benefit the downstream and prevent huge costs afterwards. Think if, in fact, the wet markets for this particular scenario had not been allowed to continue and that this virus had not been allowed to generate, spread into an intermediate host and then go global, that we would have all these resources to do progressive work rather than reinventing the wheel. Now, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. I think we just need to learn. And you know, all the cliches, history will, you know, repeat itself if we don't learn. We don't seem to be learning. And I think that we need to revisit that really proactively once this thing's contained, and stop the next pandemic from, again, derailing the planet's economy and its future, particularly for the next generation of children.
Does COVID-19 worry you?
Yes. I think it's like other severe infections that we also tend to ignore. People may not know, but sepsis, COVID is a sepsis syndrome. So it's a syndrome where whether it's a bacterial infection, which is what we're used to in our ICUs, can produce organ failure and death, leading cause. It constitutes, 41 million cases a year and 11 million deaths. It's more common cause of death than all of the cancers combined, yet you don't hear about it. So I think this needs to be brought forefront. Particularly because the burden of these deaths is in young children and low and middle income countries, which again are the future of this planet, the people that are going to really need to fix the scenarios that are now being dealt out to them.
We've been hearing something called, well, maybe I'm making this up, people being fatigued with all the lockdown measurements that have been in place to try to contain the spread of COVID-19. Would you say that the first wave is over?
It depends on where you are. I'm not sure in the United States it's already been stated several times they've ever finished their first wave. I think every pandemic that we have from recorded history always has a second wave. So it clearly motivates us to assume it's going to happen and be prepared. I don't think this is going to go quietly into the night until we have an effective vaccine. But we don't know. We really don't know.
How would you assess Canada's response to COVID-19?
I think at many levels we did a good job. At some we did not do a good job. Obviously, long-term care facilities, for example, was a major failure. But I think in other ways the public responded appropriately. They followed advice, although it changed a lot. It was generally on target. And I think that we've done well. Could we have done better? Yes, but we've done well.
Where do you think we could have done better?
Well, long-term care for sure, and earlier responses, and dealing more with imported cases, because clearly a lot of these came from the U.S. in the early days, and mitigating cases that continue to come in, or at least having better systems to define them and observe them and prevent them.
And when you look at what's happening around the world globally, what are we doing right and what are we doing wrong?
Well, sadly, the United States is demonstrating what to do wrong. I think many other countries have done extremely well. And island nations obviously may have had the easiest job in New Zealand and Australia of containing it, but quickly it can reappear. I think one of the major gaps is that we've just been funded to do this, and I think it's really important, is asking the questions, what does COVID do to pregnant women? And what impact could it have not only on making birth outcomes worse, but also on neurodevelopment and outcome of those children exposed in utero, in the womb. We're learning a lot in science and medicine recently, and that seems to be one of the most important areas where your proverbial, gram of prevention and a kilo of cure, preventing infections in pregnant women can mitigate all sorts of lifelong problems. And I think...
Such as?
Well, for example, I'll give you a North American problem and I'll give you an African problem. So we just finished a study looking at malaria and pregnancy. 125 million pregnant women are at risk of malaria every year. Even if they get malaria and it's quickly treated, it alters neurodevelopment in children, and that probably will persist for their life. In North America, flu is a common infection. We have a vaccine for it. The Center for Disease Control did an elegant study decades ago that looked at, does flu really make pregnancy outcomes worse? And it didn't. But they re-enrolled those children 20 years later, and their risk of bipolar disorder went up 4 times. Influenza does not cause bipolar disorder, but our current understanding of many neuropsychiatric disorders, autism, bipolar, major depression, schizophrenia, is that we have genetic susceptibility, but it doesn't usually manifest. It needs a second hit. The second hit can be an infection in a pregnant woman because it alters neurodevelopment in that child and makes those diseases more likely to manifest. So think about that. A simple prevention in pregnancy for flu, preventing decades of neuropsychiatric illness that costs not only huge impact of families and communities, but healthcare dollars. That is in part preventable.
A lot of ripple effects. Dr. Kane, I know you're very busy, and we appreciate you making time for us. Thank you so much for your insights this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you.
A mysterious rock formation that's long had people speculating about its origins got people talking this summer in Thunder Bay and beyond. Charnel Anderson covers the northwestern part of the province for Ontario Hubs. She's in Red Rock on the north shore of Lake Superior and joins us now to explain. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So let's talk about this rock formation that sits at the bottom of Boulevard Lake. People have been able to see it now because the lake has been drained. Tell us about this rock formation, because we have some really great drone footage.
So there's a lot that we still don't know about the rock formation, but what we do know, as you can see, it's quite large. It's about 35 meters across, and it's made of more than 1,000 rocks. Typically, it's under Boulevard Lake. Obviously, it's not right now because the city has drained the lake to do some work on a central dam downstream a little bit. But researchers believe that the rock ring does predate construction of the dam, which would have been in the 20th century, meaning that where you see it today, not underwater, is likely where it was when it was created. So it's been a great opportunity for both residents and researchers who want to take a closer look at the rock ring.
Obviously, you talk about being able to look at it closely, but let's talk about some of the technology that's being used to study the rocks.
So researchers, including Scott Hamilton, who is an anthropologist at Lakehead University, and faculty in the Department of Natural Resources Management at Lakehead University, among others, have been studying the rock ring in earnest since about 2015. And they've used a variety of different technologies, such as drone photography, as you saw. One of Scott's graduate students used sonar, so similar to like a fish finder on a boat, to study the rocks while they were underwater. They've also used something called the terrestrial LiDAR scanner, which uses laser beams to measure distance. It's pretty cool. And so all these technologies have allowed researchers to make a 3D model of the rock ring, which they can access at any time, and that allows them to get a better understanding of the rock ring's orientation, as well as its relation to other features such as the old Current River waterline.
So I'm curious, we look at the footage, some people may look at it and see, a circular formation with rocks and be like, well, what's the big deal? But I'm curious, what are researchers hoping to determine?
Right. So I think the main question is, what the heck could this be? There's been a lot of speculation as to what it might be. Some people think it could be leftover rocks from the construction of the dam. Scott has told me he heard people say that it could have been a prank. or perhaps the foundation for a tent revival meeting. Other people have suggested maybe it's a fishing weir, which is a structure, an underwater structure that's used to catch fish. But if it does indeed predate construction of the dam, then that means it wouldn't have been underwater, making it pretty ineffective. But there's been lots of speculation, but so far no definitive answers.
I want to talk about one of those. Some people believe that the formation has an indigenous connection as well.
Yeah, so that's actually Scott Hamilton's leading theory, is that it's indigenous in origin, perhaps a gathering place used for ceremony. So researchers have been working with local First Nation communities to kind of answer some more questions. And Scott says that most of those communities that he has worked with do believe it's indigenous in origin, but they don't all believe that. So I spoke to Robert Pierre, who is the Economic Development Officer at Fort William First Nation, and he doesn't think that it's indigenous. Now, I should clarify, because I've been calling it a rock ring, but it's not actually a complete circle, as you saw. It's missing some rocks in the southwest quadrant. That's not to say they're not there. It could be buried under the mud, but researchers have only done non-invasive work so far. They haven't moved any of the rocks or anything like that. Now, that's important because, as Robert explained, any structures of ceremonial significance in Anishinaabe culture have eastern-facing doors, not southwest-facing doors, which is why he doesn't believe it's indigenous in origin. As for what it may be, he thinks it could be a spot that was used to park horses and buggies back in the day.
Now, I am very, very curious, and very quickly, if you can help us explain. Now, this story has been very popular online and on social media. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think on one hand, it's non-COVID related news, which is nice, but it's also the mystery of it. You know, a lot of people have been commenting on social media what they think it could be. One woman said, perhaps, perhaps a kiddie pool. The rocks were used to dam a kiddie pool. A lot of people have made reference to the Curse of Oak Island. But I think my favorite comment was someone who said, leave it alone. This year has been freaky enough.
Some very interesting stuff for sure. Charnel Anderson, thank you so much. That's Charnel Anderson, our Ontario Hub's journalist covering Northwestern Ontario. And that's it for tonight's Agenda in the Summer. I'm Jay Jagnaldan. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a good weekend, and NAM will see you again on Monday.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Lori Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman, and by viewers like you. Thank you.